Welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. I am Daniel Golden, the proprietor. We are honored on day 4,429 to be hosting Linda Rui Feng, the author of Swing Back to Trout River. She'll be in conversation with Claudia Ross and Ji Hao of College of the Holy Cross Chinese Studies program. The new book is a debut novel, and it is one of my favorite novels of spring. It is slightly beautiful, as I called it. You'll learn more about it as the conversation goes on. Linda Rui Feng has lived in San Francisco, New York, and Toronto. She's a graduate of Harvard and Columbia Universities and is currently professor of Chinese cultural history at the University of Toronto. She's been twice awarded a MacDowell Fellowship for her fiction, and her prose and poetry have appeared in such journals as The Fiddlehead, Kenyon Review Online, and Washington Square Review. Ji Hao is an associate professor of Chinese Studies and the coordinator of Chinese Studies at College of the Holy Cross. His research interests include pre-modern Chinese poetry and poetics and fantastic tales and novels in late imperial China. Claudia Ross, his colleague, is recently retired professor from the Chinese Studies program at College of the Holy Cross, where her fields were linguistics and Chinese language pedagogy. And I should have asked if I pronounced that right. She's the author of numerous books, and she is also my sister. And that's how everything came together. And we are so honored to have, I think, what may be our first quadruple conversation in Boswell virtual history. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We would love to get started by hearing a little about the book and maybe a few pages read to us. So if that would be okay, we will remove ourselves from the screen and then come right back on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. And so I just want to, again, just say how fortunate I feel to be able to have this conversation. So this book is, of course, as Daniel mentioned, my first novel. And I started working on it actually starting about the same time when I started my job at the University of Toronto. And it's sort of taken shape over many years. And of course, I wasn't writing it full time. I was also pursuing my academic career. So it has taken a long time, but I'm very happy to be able to share it with you. It's just a very brief introduction. This is a story told from four different points of view characters, and they're interwoven stories. And there are three adults and a child. The three adults are a married couple, a friend of the father from university days, and also the couple's daughter. And so I like to think of this as kind of four different coming of age stories intertwined together. So I'm going to read a couple of pages for you, and it's from a kind of the middle. It's not from the very beginning of the book. It's from toward the middle of the first half. And what I'm about to read is two of these points of view characters, Momo and Kasia. They're the married couple. And the section I'm about to read is when they meet for the first time. Momo took pride in his robust constitution and the fact that, having thrown himself into his job as an engineer, he kept his mind and body in tip-top shape. But it was in 1973, the year after the national ping pong team traveled to America and back, that Momo's teeth began to torment him. This was something rooted in his makeup, bred in the bone, one might say, because Momo had inherited from his father a set of bad teeth. The day the back of his mouth began to swell so much that even turning his head took great effort, Momo had no choice but to bicycle through the industrial landscape of Silver Gourd Mountain to the clinic, which had been a stable before the factory was built. He passed the pair of spherical polyethylene tanks, now painted white with red slogans. One of them read, "First, do not be afraid of hardship." The other one read, "Second, do not be afraid to die." Momo was very much feeling the hardship of his tooth, his jaw, and indeed his entire person. At the clinic, he was greeted by Dr. Fan, who was both the doctor and dentist. They already knew each other from their Marxism study sessions. Momo pointed to the back of his jaw. Dr. Fan washed his hands in a basin, wiped them off on his coat, which looked more like a butcher's uniform, and pried open Momo's mouth. Momo winced. Dr. Fan did too. "I've never seen such severe misalignment," he said, as if he'd stumbled upon a new species of mushroom in the woods. Momo waited. Dr. Fan angled his head lower and squinted again into the recess of his mouth. "Did you know," he said, taking a step back to rummage for something, "that the per capita toothpaste consumption in the developed nations is 7 tubes per year? In China, it's 1 tube a year." Momo tried to think about the numerator and denominator in this aggregate number and many other such numbers that needed to be raised. "It must have been pulled down by the rural population," he managed to say. "It's a national disgrace," Dr. Fan mumbled. He had found a flashlight and directed the beam inside Momo's mouth. "You're getting a wisdom tooth," Dr. Fan told him. "Given your misalignment, it's bound to hurt." He elaborated on this oddity of human evolution, how these vestigial molars creep up in people just when they think they are safely out of reach of all growing pains. "Can you get rid of it?" Momo said. "We will eradicate it," Dr. Fan said, "like we eradicate counter-revolutionaries against the proletarian people." The pain from being handled was making Momo drool. This was also when he noticed Dr. Fan had an assistant with him, a woman who looked to be his age. She had on a white surgical mask and was fiddling with the bottles on the counter for minor maladies, alcohol for prepping, and a large bottle of mercurochrome for disinfecting cuts. "We have a bit of anesthesia," Dr. Fan said, "but best if you close your eyes." Okay, so that's the end of the passage that I'm going to read.
Let's see if I can help everybody get back. There we are. I was wondering if you could say a little more about the 4 main characters so people get a feel for them.
Okay, sure, yes. At the start of the novel, we first meet Junie, the child, the daughter, who is 10 years old at this time, and the year is 1986. We gradually get sort of further back in time from 1986, and we kind of move back upstream in time, so to speak, so that we kind of retrace the youth and childhoods of her father, her mother, and then the stories of the 4th character, Dawn, who was a good friend of Momo, the father, during their university days. So we kind of get the backstory of kind of how Junie comes into the prequels, as you will, of Junie's story through the other the adult characters, and intertwined with these coming of age stories with the 3 characters. Of course, we have the background of the early days of the PRC, leading up to the Cultural Revolution, and then leading up into the 70s, when they're sort of after the Cultural Revolution, and then gradually back to the 80s. And we also cross, this is also a story that takes place both in China and in America. So we go from, Beijing and Trout River in China, and we go to Reagan era America, in San Francisco, and in a city called Chimney Bluffs in the Great Plains, in America, and kind of back and forth. So it's a story that kind of bounces back and forth between time and also across space. So how's
not
that
always the easiest thing. You wove it together beautifully.
Thank you.
Did you want to ask your names question, Claudia?
Yes, I do, if that's okay. So names have significance in Chinese in the way that they don't in English, because every character in a name, every syllable in a name means something. And I know that in Chinese literature, the names of characters are often a clue to the personality of the characters. There's something about them. So in your book, there's only one character who has a Chinese name, and that's Momo, or Momo, right? Nobody else has a Chinese name. There's one person, the artist, who looks like he has a Chinese name, but it's not. It's H-U-E Sheng, and it's hue, as in the colors for hue. So I was wondering if that was a deliberate choice to give people English names rather than to give them Chinese names. And Momo, even Momo's name is not really Chinese, it's like a nickname, right? It's not, it's a baby name that he grows up with.
Yeah, that's a great question, Claudia. And I wanted to give, the answer might disappoint you a little bit in that I really only thought extensively about Momo's name. And I was interested in this kind of, the idea that he started with a borrowed, like a temporary name, yeah. that it was a name that to his parents, who did not know whether he will survive, gave him. And there is this this, and of course I did mention that when he grew up and went to school, the name Momo becomes more dignified, sort of becomes like a official name. I think also Dawn, I guess I should add Dawn, whose name's Han, it has more of a kind of an official name. And I think one thing that, if this was not a kind of a systematic decision, it kind of came about more organically and kind of accreted through the writing process. And I do, I think part of it is that I do think of these names as very temporary. So, to kind of extrapolate on Momo's childhood experience of being a very sickly child. I'm interested in playing with the temporariness of this, the fact that they're spelled, the fact that they're not stable, and I like thinking about them as such, and as being malleable, as frangible or fungible maybe, and of course that also is part of the theme of immigration. And often when people immigrate, they change their names, or they lose parts of their names, or just by virtue of having to use an alphabetic writing system, the tone on your names are lost. And so like that kind of instability that comes about from just moving around, from growing up, from moving around, from these linguistic systems, that sometimes do not accommodate all the, the layers of meaning that's associated with one's name. I'm kind of fascinated with that.
Did not disappoint. That was great.
Gee, I'd love for you. You have my favorite question. So, would you, being that we actually pieced this together because Linda had spoken at G's conference at Holy Cross, and when we were trying to come up with somebody. And so you have nonfiction, your interest, your nonfiction interests overlap as well. I'd love for you to, G, talk about, ask.
Okay, yeah, I can certainly ask a question. And then, so the first time I met Linda is a scholar, right, giving the presentation on the Tang Dynasty narratives. Now this time you are talking about your own novel. That's really amazing. Okay, so first I want to say congratulations on your accomplishment, and zooming back to Trout River. It's a really excellent and powerful novel. And as I read the novel, I can easily picture what was going on in the story. I can see the pictures and hear the different sounds, and even the one you just read about the dialogue between the Dr. Fan and the Momo, right? It's just like the movie, it's kind of in front of my eyes. And so it's really great. I think you did a really excellent job capturing these the moments here. And also another example is the beginning, right? The beginning of the novel, and you talk about the people, right, on the train, how they crack open the sunflower seeds, and the people how we use the galaxy shape of the mosquito repellent in the summer days. I grew up in China; those things I experienced. So it's kind of so many familiar things came back to me. So it's really it's great. Okay, and also I know you are a scholar in the pre-modern Chinese literature, and your book, right, is a scholarly book. It's called The City of Marvel and Transformation, and the Chang'an and the narratives of experience in Tang Dynasty China. Right? So that book explored life experiences and in the Chang'an, and also how they come to us through writings. And I can also see the connection between your scholarly work and your novel here. So this time you're not doing the scholarly study, but created a novel that actually has brought life experience to us. Right? So I'm also working on this. I just want to share some kind of my reading experience first. People ask questions. So I'm also working on this pre-modern Chinese literature. I was very excited when I was able to recognize, some elements from the traditional Chinese literature and culture in your novel, right? For example, so when it comes to the Momo's meeting with Dang, right, there is a mention of the mulberry trees. And in some traditional Chinese poems, right, the mulberry trees serve as a place for romance, right? So when I saw the mulberry trees, I know I kind of predict that, okay, so romance is gonna happen, right? And so I did. I saw this kind of romance between the Momo and down there, and also when I saw the Kasha, right, couldn't explain her decision in English, right? But only in Chinese expression. I was wondering, okay, what would that Chinese expression be, right? And then I thought about probably it's a 缘分已尽, right? So, and the next page, it was there. You present that. It's exciting. All right. So, and one of the important concept in your novel is the 造化, right? So the 造化in the Chinese is a maker or transmuter, right? You indicated in your novel the makings or the transmutation, right? And transmutation of the world, and which is closely associated with Zhuangzi, the philosopher, right? Who lived in around the 4th century BC China. You actually mentioned there's you didn't point out his name, but you said the poet, the philosopher poet, right? In the novel, and also on the page. So I'm looking at the notes on the page 9 and page 8. And so you mentioned there's a fashioner of the creature, and there is a Zhuangzi, and you talk about the cricket arm and the rat's liver. So that's actually coming from a chapter, right, in the Zhuangzi. So basically, for those who haven't read the Zhuangzi's book, basically there was the person called the Master Lai who fell ill, and then he was lying on his deathbed and surrounded by his family, and they all cry and began to cry. But his friend Master Li came to visit, and he said, okay, said, Shu, get back, don't disturb the process of change, right? He then talked to the master Lai, said, how marvelous the creator is. What is he going to make out of you next? Will he make you into a rat's liver? Will he make you into a bug's arm? So that is the phrase, expression used, incorporated in your novel, right? So there is kind of the sense of the transformation, and also the transformation is kind of related to the concept of the yuanfeng here. So my question is, how is your, in your opinion, how is your novel informed by your scholarship and your knowledge of the traditional Chinese culture or the literature, and what has inspired you to integrate those elements into your novel, into your story?
Well, thank you, Chi, for that wonderful reading, and also just extensive interpretation and commentary, bringing in all this wonderful threads. Well, and also thank you for mentioning my scholarly work, even though it's been a few years. Well, I mean, so there's a kind of a more practical, I'll answer it in a more practical way first, and then I'll kind of step back a little bit. What in my scholarship, I work on texts that are kind of, not, I work on a period of time when there were texts that survived, but not everything has survived. So I'm constantly battling the non-survival of books and documents from, like, say, for example, the 9th century. And I'm constantly trying to, as a scholar, trying to fill the void and trying to make connections and play the detective in order to kind of piece together some other kinds, a more complete glimpse than sometimes we have documents for. With fiction writing, I kind of have permission, if you will, to do that in a more wholesale way. So with scholarship, I can do that, but only up to a certain extent. There's sometimes just I sometimes, as we cannot make come to conclusions about certain texts or books because there's just simply not enough documentary evidence. And we kind of have to stop and say, okay, this is all we can really say about this. And with creative fiction, with fiction, you can continue to ask questions. Why was something, this way? Why did, what are we missing? And we are more able to come up with answers, or at least tentative answers. And I find that a really interesting difference in between the two enterprises. And so in that sense, in a very practical sense, what I do with Chang'an, in the Tang, are not directly part of the fiction writing that I do, but the spirit of it is there. And then you mentioned, these, I confess, I did not think about the mulberry tree connection myself. So you're a wonderful reader and wonderfully astute. It did not actually occur to me. I was just thinking about the fact that in Beijing, there were mulberry trees, and that they were common. So thank you for actually making this sound more rich than it actually I had intended. But about Zhuang's, so even though I don't, as a scholar, I'm not an expert on Zhuang's at all. He's someone that I've always read with great pleasure, and I can return to his work over and over again, and I always think, how wonderful. It just seems like it's a bottomless treasure trove of language, of ideas, of the passage that you read is actually, of course, one of my favorite in this kind of a dialogue about life and death without the weight of tragedy and sadness, and without any whiff of the decay of old age that you expect, or infirmity or old age, because we know some of these characters are pretty deformed and they're quite kind of beaten up by life, and yet the language, what they say about what's coming. I don't know that I would ever be able to have that kind of outlook when I'm struck by illness and disaster of this kind. But I always find it really inspiring to think about that, and to think about the fact that these, trauma, disaster, disease, death, they're kind of being categorized as change. And in fact, of course, they are. We can say that, but then to think of them as such, and to ask the question, what will I be made into next, rather than sort of lamenting the end of something. They're actually asking about what might be the beginning of something else. And I find that extremely moving, and also just generative, and at times, of course, also comforting. So yeah, this is one philosopher poet that I just find a lot of, I really find a lot of kind of source of inspiration from.
Thank you so much. I do. I also find a lot of. I also like reading the drawings as well. And so you mentioned there is kind of the. If you don't mind, I just ask as a related question. So you mentioned there's a kind of the difference between the scholarly writing and the creative writing. So you talk about there is more freedom for you as a novelist or the creative writer, right? So you can explore, right, these kind of different possibilities there, and so this can also help me think about this kind of you also mentioned about this kind of life here, right? You use a lot of metaphors of the life throughout the novel there. So, and you trying to, and characters in the novel also, they are trying to explore their different possibilities of life, right? So they both, on becoming himself and on becoming other, the person or other possibilities, right? And like the Kasha, right? Who was originally trying to be herself, but also actually becomes the other woman, right, in the novel as well. So back to life here. So life as a metaphor throughout the novel, you can see that, and the music, right? You compare life to music, and the river, right, and also the road. And so one of the example is Edmund. Edmund told Dawn here is, so I'm just a street lamp on your road of life, headed to God knows where, right? I sort of like this here. Okay, and another metaphor regarding the life is the Momo. When Momo was driving, right? There is the passage describing this the driving there. So it says, during those drives, he found that he was addicted to seeing the landscape move backward past him to speed. Some days even without any destination. So so could you maybe talk a little bit more about the life, and what's your idea of a life, and what does the novel want to say about life?
Okay.
A little light philosophy.
Right.
Well, that's a very ambitious question, but of course I'll try to answer it. So of course, I don't. Of course, I don't have a definitive, answer to what do I think of life, but indeed, this is, the constant question of how do we make a life? How do we improvise? What happens when we plan for something in life and we don't get it? What do we do? And these are all questions that come from trying to make a life, and I think they're the very fabric of things that drive me to write and to write fiction. And I think about you know, there's this quote by the author Andrea Barrett, who has written novels. You know, I'm not, I won't try to introduce her, but she has this really wonderful saying in an interview. She said, you know, there's no point in being a writer if you feel at home in the world. And so I guess, you know, a short answer, or at least one version of the answer is that I'm fascinated by people who, like me, don't feel at home in the world for one reason or another. And, you know, they could be emigres, they could be immigrants, or they could just be outsiders of various kinds. And there's just so many reasons to not feel at home in the world. And I'm very interested in what you do, what you actually, how you deal with that not at homeness. And I hope that in some way or another, the four characters in my book have all sort of contributed their own solution to this problem, which is, you know, different, in very different ways. And so there's that larger question. And then as to the metaphors, you know, about road, about, I think you mentioned like driving, and,
right.
you know, I'm also interested in velocity. So I'm interested in movements because, you know, I personally, you know, grew up, you know, moving around a lot, you know, within China itself. But you know, of course, I, you know, arrived in the U.S. and then now I'm in Canada. So, you know, my life is full of movements and and mobility, geographical mobility. And I'm fascinated by, you know, what that kind of, whether you call it displacement, whether you call it, you know, travel or a quest, or, you know, what, you know, whatever you call it, what that effect has on us, on people, on, you know, on how we feel, how rooted we feel to some place. And so, you know, I'm fascinated with, you know, cars, you know, speed, you know, lamps on the highway. And, you know, these are things that I kind of, they help me chip away at some of these questions, I guess. Is one way to answer it. And I appreciate you, you know, culling all these, you know, pieces from the novel. It's, you know, you're really a wonderful reader. So I'm very lucky to have these questions.
Novels should have more academic readers. So they don't know what hidden gems there are. And the other thing that's so interesting is that you say that you didn't know, but so often a writer is, you know, there's a subconscious element to writing as well. And, you know, it just because you didn't know you wrote it doesn't mean that there wasn't a part of you. It was there.
You still get credit.
Yeah, that's right. We'll find. Every so often we'll talk to an author who will like be vehemently deny, and I was like, no, it's there. We had a conversation where my book club talked to a writer, and we all came up with a completely different theory about what the book was about than the author did, and it was so consistent. So I always find that interesting. It's sort of like when people talk about art. Or music too. Music is such an important part. That was going to be the next question. Is, you know, it's a conversation between the creator and the viewer, and this is part of the conversation, I guess. I wanted to talk about music. You mentioned music, and music is such an important part of the book that all the characters are sort of kind of divided between what they should be doing and what they want to do. And often that becomes music. You know, there are other arts as well. Would you like to talk about how you found music in the book, you know, what it meant to you in the book and how you tried to incorporate it? Almost the structure of the book almost feels like a musical composition, by the way. It's not chapters, they're movements to me, so.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And, you know, I'm very flattered to hear that. And so I'll first, you know, just kind of come out and say I'm not you know, I'm not trained in music in any way. I'm really just, when it comes to music, I'm an amateur. You know, I played in the high school orchestra for 2 years, but that's about the extent of my musical involvement. So since then, which is decades now, I've really not been inside that world. I've been an outside observer. And but something about being the outside observer animates me. I love actually that kind of, you know, just you know, thinking about that world as an amateur, as a non-practitioner, and you know, as someone who might not be able to explain the intricacies and the designs of, for example, you know, why a certain piece will have a certain kind of power over us. But I'm fascinated with how we can sometimes, as you know, as people deny the power that certain arts have over us, and we sometimes inadvertently keep them at bay. So I mean, first I'm thinking about Momo, who had a you know, very kind of precious experience, sort of being inducted into the world of music by a friend during their formative years, and who kind of decides at the end of his university days that he wants to stay away. And I'm fascinated with the dance that people kind of that tension between wanting to be useful, wanting to spend your life doing something that you know will contribute to society, however, whatever form that you imagine, and being drawn to the quote unquote, you know, so-called not usefulness of certain pursuits. And of course, you know, gee, I can go back to the Zhuangzi reference here too. You know, Zhuangzi, the poet philosopher, also famously talked about how valuable it is to be not useful in the world, because if you're too useful, you know, you're not likely to always survive. So, but that's perhaps a tangential point. So you know, I'm interested in seeing that confrontation between usefulness and the obsessive quality that you know, arts, for example, music, bring out in us. And so yeah, so that's one way to answer that question.
Okay. Oh, that's great.
I try to be quiet. I try to be like when we're making a little noise in the next room, but it comes back.
Yeah. Daniel, can I ask a question regarding the music?
Yeah.
All right. So I also like the notice the role of the music in your novel, and also when I take a closer look at it, I saw there is kind of somehow related to the wood there. So I was wondering what is the significance of wood? Because the violin, you know, is made out of the wood, right? And both men here, the grandpa made a wooden horse, right, for the journey, and Momo made a wooden violin for the journey. And actually, the Dong also kept a bridge, which also made of wood, right, from the violin. And she actually handed the piece of the wood, right, and to Edmund, who could recognize its artistry. So there is and also there is a connection. You give the description of the bridge there, wood bridge there. It's like a heart. There's empty space like a heart, right? So there's kind of connection between the wood and the person's life, human beings there. So so I was wondering, and also there is in a novel there is kind of there's a story when so what's certain, Dang, right? Remember, okay, I'm sorry, get a bit confused about names here. And her violin was destroyed, right? Crushed, right? But only after that, right? And did he start to really understand the architecture of the violin, right? So I was wondering, and that's kind of is that also, you know, if you connect that to the life here, so if the life gains or regains a new meaning after it was, you know, to some extent destroyed, right? So how you interpret this kind of the significance of the music and the wood, right? I'm not sure if you think about this. I'm just curious when I read. Oh, wood again, wood again. All right.
No, thank you for that question. It's a wonderful question, and you know, I think about not wood. I have to say, I think about sometimes when I think of the opposite of wood, which is plastic. Every day, you know, when I unwrap like a food item from the grocery store, I think, oh, another piece of plastic, and but you know, you know, there's also another violin in the story that's made of either glass or acrylic or some other, you know, inorganic material that actually is also sort of stands in tension with the wood instrument. And of course, you know, wood is a wonderful material in the sense that before it becomes a violin, before it becomes a bridge, it has a life. It has had a life of its own, and you know, it's an organic. You know, it has a life. It actually has its life written into its, you know, makeup, its fabric, or you know, in the rings, and it's a very practiced eye would be able to tell you a lot about that tree, about where it's living, for example. And so, you know, musical instruments, you know, string instruments in this case, actually really embody that sort of pre-existent life, you know, the life that existed before it was an instrument. And I think that's also another fascination that I have, you know, and not about music per se, but about the musical instruments as an embodiment of the kind of life and kind of devotion and obsession that musicians have. You know, in the course of writing the novel, I read a lot of interviews with violinists and about their violins. And there's you know, you know, sometimes the interviewer will ask the violinist, you know, how do you feel about your violin? You know, what is it? You know, what was it like to lose your violin? You know, what would you say to your violin? How do you care for it? And the answers are always so astonishing and so wonderful. And they sometimes say they have to coax the violin into life. There are days when the violin doesn't behave, and they just kind of have to go with it. And some of them will say, like, you know, I'm not the master. The violin is the master here. And so it's kind of it's an inanimate object that has, you know, animus, you know, sort of power and organic power. And I think that's another way of thinking about practicing arts. You know, I also think that that's something that maybe writers can draw inspiration from, and to think of our medium as something a little bit more alive than things that we bring into it. And yeah, so you know, wood, of course, is you know, the both the architecture and sort of something more than the sum of its parts. And thank you also for bringing the parts about making the prosthetic leg. I also, you know, that's also something close to my heart, like thinking this act of, you know, you mentioned these objects that you were familiar with. You know, one of the childhood memories I have is seeing carpenters at work. And you know, sort of old-fashioned carpentry, and I didn't really understand how this could be done, you know, but there's something just really wonderful about seeing a wood sort of being planed, seeing it sort of, you know, sort of its kind of patterns brought out by the varnish, and smelling the wood as it is kind of being molded into something, you know, else, another life, another transformation, if you will. And so I try to bring that spirit into that scene when the grandfather is making a set of legs for his granddaughter. So.
Oh, Claudia, this is your moment to talk about family relationship.
Grandfather, I don't want to talk about it, but I want to ask about it. So there are two grandfathers. There's another grandmother, but the grandmother doesn't play a major role. But both of the grandfathers play a major role with respect to the granddaughter and the grandson, and the granddaughter and the granddaughter, right? In both cases, is the right, and they both do some transforming too, right? You know, clearly Junie's grandfather is the one who's the carpenter, and he transforms this wood into things that give her the mobility that you were also talking about earlier, you and G. So we've got that transformation from something to the mobility theme again. But why grandfathers? Why did you deliberately pick the grandfather as the person to transmit something about, well, it's culture, but it's a transformation for both of them. Why it was the grandfather that you selected to do that in both cases?
Yeah, that's a great question, Claudia. And like most great questions, they always make me kind of fidget a little bit and think, why did I really do that? I guess, you know, I don't have a really, really good answer. I'll try to give you an answer, which is that, you know, the way I imagine the two the grandparents for Junie is that they're both, you know, pretty formative in terms of shaping her life. I think it's probably fair to say that with Dawn, like really being an orphan and having one grandparent is more the kind of the situation here, and then that's a good question, why wasn't there a grandmother? And I think probably, so, you know, what I'll say, you know, and this is something I've only thought about for 30 seconds. So is that there's something I find slightly curmudgeonly about the grandfather character, in that that he's not a verbal person. He's not effusive, and he's not, well, he's prone to some temper, let's just say. And there's something that I find fascinating in family members who embody that dual nature of not being ostensibly warm and affectionate, and yet being innately very warm and affectionate. And that's something that I think about a lot in terms of, you know, how do our lives gestures, how do we kind of create gestures of love and hope and expectation for children and also grandchildren? And perhaps, I guess my answer is perhaps with a grandmother, it would seem more likely that there will be more natural affection and kind of, you know, this is a very bad, you know, use of word, but let's say cuddliness, you know, involved in the relationship, even if they're equally loving. And I wanted to bring out that slightly curmudgeonly character of a grandfather, and to kind of and look at, you know, what can you do, you know, as a single, not just a single parent, but a single grandparent for a child that is slightly problematic, and how, you know, what do you do in that situation, and how does the child grow up to unwrap or to unpack the lessons that this single grandparent tries to impart on her, perhaps decades later. And I'm interested in that relationship. So I guess intuitively, it seemed more likely that will happen with a grandfather rather than a grandmother. So that's my answer.
We can't let this hour go without you talking about the chapter, The Improviser's Guide to Untranslatable Words. It's what made me, I mean, I was so enjoying the book. And when I read that chapter, I completely fell in love. And not only that, but I sort of started screaming and was like, I have to call my sister. I have to call my sister. So beautiful and interesting. What do you have to say, Claudia?
I just want to say, talk some about Rui Feng. And G in particular talked a lot about Zahua, right? But the third term that you have in that trio is Ciji, the stimulus, right? And for English, stimulus is a neutral word, but I think in Chinese, it's more negative than it is neutral. And so I wanted to talk about the role of Ciji, the stimulus, in the way that you thought about the story. And then I agree with Daniel. I read it. I took notes, and then I got to that chapter and said, oh, there they are, right here. The what is it? Not untranslatable terms, but these words that don't translate from English to Chinese, even though they look like they do. That's all I want to say.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both. And I mean, it's a writer's dream come true when a reader screams in the middle of reading. And I was like, you've made my day. Yeah, thank you, Claudia, for that question about Siji. And you know, I kind of thought about that chapter not as any particular term, but as a set of terms that are very just kind of thorny for any kind of bilingual work, and of course I'm in writing this book, I'm constantly shuttling between the two language, and so I'm constantly thinking about that. And with words like 造化 that Ji was mentioning earlier, I mean, that word is ancient, it's old, it's very it's been commented on, and there's no shortage of commentary and scholarship on its history. But just at a very at everyday level, words like 刺激 or 缘分 are actually I find it very difficult to convey and do them justice. And that to me seems like a great opportunity to be more verbose. If you can't explain it in 2 sentences, then perhaps it's good to explain it in 20 pages. And so that was my goal. But yes, it's with 刺激, I thought about all the ways that it brings up, either trauma or, stimulus, but not, they're just all sorts of pseudo translatable terms that could stand in for it. But in the context of the story, I really wanted to use it as a way to bring out Kasha's story, and to really bring out the fact that not being able to replace these words with a ready English one also puts her in a very kind of vulnerable and isolated position across the Pacific Ocean, when she is suddenly have to think about what she wants to do, and she has no ready way to articulate her problem to people around her who are trying to help. And I find that problem interesting, and also a great opportunity to think about what it is that make us rethink our past, rethink our problems, and try to find a solution. So I would say 刺激 is a set of words that I had in mind, and there wasn't a particular goal I had for that word. It was more for the overall enterprise, uphill battle for translation that I was trying to convey.
We have a question. Would somebody love for you to talk a little about, Karen in particular, would love for you to talk a little about the title of the book. The story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. It wasn't easy to decide on a title for this, but I will say that for a long time, this book had a working title of The Importance of Floating. And it's a reference, of course, to Junie's early kind of outburst or determination to stay in Trout River. And so swimming back to Trout River is kind of another way of getting at this pivotal moment. And this is kind of how I think of the novel as sort of unfolding, sort of the moment of like everything kind of setting into motion is when a child decides that she doesn't want to move, and that she's rooted in her place, and she feels at home there in her ecology of relationships, and she sort of puts her foot down and says, I'm not going to go anywhere, and she comes up with creative solutions to get around this imperative to emigrate, really. And so swimming back to Trout River is is kind of a reference to that childlike determination, which then gets at the question of, what does it mean to pursue motion? What does it mean to immigrate? What does it mean to leave home? So that's how the title came about.
So we were, yesterday, Claudia and I were convincing G to write a novel. And I do believe that, G, when you do write it, it will be studied in semiotics classes for the next 50, 60 years. So I would love, do you have another question you would like to ask? Because I'm always fascinated.
Yeah, I do have that other questions. You are allowed to ask a question. All right. So yeah, I think first of all, I want to say thank you for explanation of the book title. That actually was my question as well. So because I noticed that in the novel it says there is at least like the two places there is kind of references to the title of the novel. So one, Junie told her grandpa, right? And so it's the one just mentioned. He said if the grandpa sent her away to America, she will turn into a fish and swim back to the Trout River, right? So I have another question, right? Is there a real place called Trout River in China?
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
There, as far as I know, no. But of course, if there is, I wouldn't be surprised. But to answer a question you haven't asked, which is why is it fictional? The same way that there shouldn't, at least as far as I know, there is not a Chimney Bluffs in the Great Plains. And I wanted to, devise a name that the readers can kind of inhabit with the characters rather than a pre-existing name. Obviously, San Francisco is an exception, but I think with the smaller places, that was what I was hoping for.
Yeah, it's very unusual to have writers use real small places every so often, and then people are convinced they know what you were. They start making assumptions that they don't make with larger places. I was very curious if you could, because I'm sure other folks are interested in, you've written about some subjects that people have written about before, certainly the immigrant narrative, which is very important and very popular, and also the Cultural Revolution story. And I was curious in tackling these areas, like what did you want to bring to the story that you felt hadn't really been told before?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Daniel. And yes, absolutely. There are certainly a lot of other, tellings of immigration and of the Cultural Revolution. So my sort of saving, kind of like my mental strategy was to think, one, there is never a single immigration story, and just as there isn't a single monolithic Cultural Revolution history or micro-history or narrative. And so, it's never a problem, I guess, to have another one. They're complex and large enough, and they're certainly complicated enough that I think we can use more, and there wouldn't be a problem. I think with maybe I'll start with the Cultural Revolution and then go to immigration. With Cultural Revolution, definitely, I find that with readers who I have been conversing with, there's a lot of there are a lot of questions, and what I wanted to. English language readers, I should say, are very curious, and of course, Chinese language readers have more knowledge, but I think there's, here, this is also important, that I think I wanted to bring in, not just the catastrophe and the trauma and the tragedy and the violence of it, which are obviously there and obviously cannot be ignored. I'm also really interested in moments in in that history that take place first on sort of more insignificant lives, in sort of smaller lives, in smaller moments. And then I'm also interested in different kinds of emotional tonalities of emotion. So for example, bewilderment, ambivalence, these emotions that are not actually often written about. It's just sheer confusion, I think, depending on who you are and your level of involvement and your relationship with either as a victim or as perpetrator of violence. So I want to look at these different shades of complicity, these different shades of understanding in the moment. And so, the moment that she had mentioned when Dawn actually hands over the bridge to Edmund, it's after the fact, it's after the Cultural Revolution had ended. But I would say that she actually gains a new understanding in that moment, because she's kind of realizing that she's turning an experience of hers, a very private experience of hers, into something useful. In fact, she was kind of using it as a token to get to the next phase of her life. And it's a complicated transition. It's a complicated transformation. And, that's kind of a very small moment, but I think it's also really important. So I wanted to bring that out. And with immigration, I guess, we read a lot about what happens to families when they arrive in the U.S., the kind of struggles they go through, the kind of hardships and the different forms of racism and difficulties that they have to undergo. I guess one of the things that really attracted me to Junie's story is that she provides the counterpoint to immigration story. And I wanted to think about immigration from the other side, which is, what happens when you resist immigration, or what happens when you try to understand immigration from your native place, as a person who's left behind. And it's a different way of thinking about what immigrants give up when they actually leave. And maybe, in the case of Momo and Kasha, they might not realize what they have given up at the moment that they make the journey. But that counterpoint or counter voice, if you will, gives us another way of thinking about that. In what they give up also, I think, is perhaps less visible and less obvious than what they're going for. And so I wanted to take that opportunity to think about that the other side of the looking glass, so to speak.
Wouldn't that be an interesting class to teach, the narrative of anti-immigration? I just thought of another, if you've ever read Comme Tobin, he has a novel, Brooklyn, about the woman who comes over, and then he has Nora Webster about the family that doesn't come over. And he wrote them that they're talking to each other because he wrote them in sequence. They're not the same family or anything, but they're, I love that. Now I'm going to look for more books like that. So the Junie, I'll call it Junie 101, but I'm not getting to teach anything. So I'm going to leave that to either Jiha or Claudia. Do you guys have any other questions? Otherwise, I think we're going to wrap it up.
I just going to say many more questions, but I'm not going to ask them because we don't have time. But the more I started thinking about questions in preparation for talking with you today, well, I read the book twice, and then I started thinking about questions. The more rich I realized the book was and how many directions it took me. So thank you so much for writing it.
I second that.
Yeah. I also want to say thank you, Linda. It's really it's a wonderful book, and I just feel like I learned a lot of things from the book. Not just about the question I asked about the connection between the Chinese literature and these kind of elements from the Chinese culture, but also there's kind of the narrative experience. The local motion, right, from one place to another, and how you interweave different threads together. It's fabulous. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I'm really privileged to have you guys as readers. It's really wonderful.
Oh, the privilege is ours. Thank you. And really, it was just wonderful to have both of you with me on the conversation. It was a wonderful honor. And of course, thanks to everybody who tuned in. We wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you, and in person too, some browsing. Continued success to you. And have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Daniel.